Hey guys, Navonod here, Navonod on NLH. I just did this entire presentation, didn't watch the clock, and it took me an hour and 10 minutes, so I'm going to speed through this. I've got a lot of information I want to cover, and I want to get through it quickly. So today's poker video is going to be on poker mythos, dispelling common poker misconceptions and weighing in on things that are probably debatable, that are maybe masquerading as poker wisdom, or popular poker mythos, or mythology. My first topic that I like to beat up on is the idea that there are only two reasons to bet, the idea that there are two reasons to bet plus a possible third reason to bet, and the old school, circa 2006, 24 different reasons to bet. Way back in the day when I first started playing pretty seriously, we had a probe bet, we had a showdown raise, we had a informational bet, informational raise. We would bet for protection, we'd bet for value, we'd bet as a bluff, we'd bet to induce bluffs, we'd bet to stop bluffs. There were all these, just tons of cumbersome and largely ineffectual reasons to bet. I was lucky enough to go through this poker boom, playing poker already, and I got to watch on like 2+2 and some of the other poker forums and Poker School Online way back when. I got to watch some of these things evolve, and what I saw come out of the embers of this idea that there were 37 different ways and reasons to bet is that they kind of overcorrected in my estimation and said that there are only two reasons to bet. The only two reasons that exist to bet in poker are value bet or bluff. Always ask yourself, it was said, before you place a bet, will this bet fold out better hands, or will it be called by worse hands? And if the answer to both of those questions is no, then you shouldn't bet. Then another paradigm, and actually this paradigm probably preceded value bet and bluff only, but value bet bluff only took over, but value bet bluff only with a third tertiary kind of very complex, hard to explain, hard to understand, third partial reason to sometimes maybe bet for protection came about and kind of, it stood the test of time a little bit better. People still preach this, but if you listen to somebody, I was listening to a seminar on bet strategy, and you can hear really good, intelligent people talk about this subject, and when they start talking about this third partial reason to sometimes bet maybe, they get very uncomfortable, and it seems very obvious to me that the reason they're uncomfortable is because they know there's something wrong with what they're saying. They just can't quite put their finger on it. I think I have. I'm not God's gift to poker, but I think on this one topic at least, I think I can provide some clarity. What is the reality? Okay, well, the reality is it's not as simple as that, okay, in a sense. In one sense, on one level, it's not as simple as just saying you should value bet or you should bluff, and sometimes you should bet for protection or to get your opponent to fold out their equity or to protect your equity or all these things because they don't want to say protect their hand. Okay, but on one level, it's actually much simpler than that. You should just bet when betting is the most plus EV option available to you, which is true, but it also sounds a little bit like you should bet when you should bet, which doesn't really convey any information. The way that I would look at it, I think this is a more complete paradigm. The two reasons to bet, you should make a wager in poker, you should bet when you can expect to get more money into a pot that you are a favorite to win either before a showdown or at showdown. That does not always mean that you are strictly value betting. One thing it can mean is that you have a strong draw. One thing it can mean is that your opponent has a very capped range, and your range is strong and uncapped. Let me give you an example. Maybe that's the easiest way. Let's say we have ace, king of clubs, we open raise the button, the big blind flat calls, the flop comes out, and we pick up a gut shot to, I don't know, the wheel or Broadway, I guess it doesn't much matter. We pick up a gut shot, and we pick up the nut flush draw, and we've got two overcards. Our opponent checks. When we make a bet here, if we make, 2/3 pot bet, or let's just say 2/3 pot. If we make a bet here, do we want our opponent to fold or do we want him to call? Would we prefer he folds or calls if we got to decide? If we could just pick. Well, I mean, there's a lot that goes into that, but I would say that this is a situation where the combination of our uncapped range, because we're pre-flop raiser and we're post-flop continuation better, the combination of his capped range, because kind of by the definition, regardless of how you construct this this board that I hypothesized or presented, whichever direction you took it in, whether it's a wheel that you're drawing to or you're drawing to Broadway, it's going to be a pretty wet board by virtue of having connected cards necessarily, and also necessarily having 2 clubs. So once your opponent checks and calls, they've capped their range. Your range is uncapped, their range is capped. You've still got all your netted value hands, they don't. You've got position, they're out of position, they've got to be a little cautious, and you've got a ton of equity. You might be a favorite to win the pot, even if you stopped all betting, flipped up the turn card, flipped up the river card, and went straight to showdown. So, if you're putting it, but you might not be the favorite, just in hot and cold equity, but even if you're not the favorite in hot and cold equity, once you figure in your fold equity on turns and rivers, and you figure out that by betting flop, betting turn, and then getting to the river, your opponent is going to be left with mostly pretty good hands. You're going to have some implied odds when you do hit your hand. So when you do make a hand, especially if it's the gut shot version of your hand, you're very likely, if you bet flop and bet turn and get called on flop, get called on turn, and then bink your straight on the river, you're very likely to get a nice big bet paid off on the river. So it's, or at least a decent sized bet. You've got implied odds here. You've got fold equity. You've got a ton of actual equity. So in a situation like this, very often it could be the case where even though you're not expecting to fold out better or be called by worse, you should still bet. And even though your opponent is almost never going to call you with a hand that's not ahead, or is very rarely going to call behind, you probably still make more money on average when your opponent calls. And if this is an imperfect example and a pure example of that, which I think it almost is, depending on stacks, certainly we could come up with, I could write down, or we could think about situations where it absolutely is the case where you will make more money in the long run. Your EV will be increased if your opponent calls, even if he's only calling with better hands. So when that's the case, well, I mean, just think of it yourself. When you're sitting here with a nut flush draw with a gut shot and 2 overcards, your opponent checks and you bet, he folds. Are you really that happy? I usually feel a little disappointed about that scenario. And if you don't, then you're probably not barreling correctly. You're not firing again. Either you're not firing often enough, or you're not firing on the correct cards. You're not taking the right lines against the right opponents who have the right ranges. So the other reason to bet, so that's the first one. Get more money into a pot when you're the favorite to win the pot, either by showdown or at showdown. So whether that means you've got a very profitable double barrel bluff, a very profitable triple barrel semi bluff, or you've just got a very strong hand, you're a favorite to win the pot, and therefore you would like to put more money in that pot as long as someone else is kind enough to match the amount of money that you put into the pot, right? I mean, if you're both going to put $50 into this pot and you're going to win 70% of it, then you'd rather that they call than that they fold, regardless of whether you want to call that a value bet or a bluff. It is just a profitable bet. Now, obviously, when you've got a set, it's pretty purely just a value bet. But I think that we can really get caught up in little logic problems or really semantics problems in our own minds and get a little tangled up and trip over these concepts when we try to put them in value bluff only. And I don't think it makes it any less cumbersome when we evoke this third kind of mystical quasi-betting reason. The actual second reason that you would want to make a bet is you would want to make a bet hoping that your opponent would relinquish their equity in the pot. So you're betting hoping to fold your opponent off of the pot. And it doesn't really, that doesn't mean you're bluffing. It doesn't mean you're protecting. it doesn't mean you're protecting your equity. What it means is that you're going to make more money in the long run if your opponent folds here than if he calls, and or than if it goes check or you check and he gets the option to bet. So it doesn't really matter if your opponent has more equity than you or if he has less equity than you. Sometimes it's just correct to try to fold his equity out. An example of this: maybe you make a light 3-bet with ace-2 suited. The flop comes out 9-5 deuce. It's pretty unlikely that your opponent's going to call you with a second best hand when you flop bottom pair in a 3-bet pot. It's also pretty unlikely that he's not going to fold better and he's not going to call with worse. But we should still bet most of the time, right? Because, like, say we're the button and hijack opens and we 3-bet with ace-2 suited, hijack calls, we go heads up to the flop, it's 9-5 deuce, he checks. Do we want to check this back? No way. Because checking back could have the positive effect of causing our opponent to bluff. We could definitely induce bluffs by checking back, but it doesn't do us any good to induce bluffs we can't call. Also, we're just free-rolling our opponent to realize whatever equity he does have without having to pay a price, without having to make a mistake to do it. And even if we take aside the fact that he's got equity, I mean, if he's got Jack 10, he's got backdoor draws on that board. He's got 2 overcards for a total of 6 additional outs. I mean, he's got kind of a draw, 6-out draw against our pair of 2s. So that's a situation where we probably should bet most of the time, even though we don't expect that our bet will fall into the value bet or bluff category. Now, we can get kind of tricky and sneaky and say, well, I am bluffing. I'm turning my hand into a 5-out semi-bluff. Okay, well, you could try that. Or you could say, I'm protecting my hand. This is one of those rare instances where it's okay to protect my hand. Whatever. I mean, that's just a semantics thing. It's a word trick, and it doesn't do any good to hold on to that. So bottom line, 2 reasons to bet. Get more money in the pot when you're a favorite to win said pot, or cause your opponent to fold his equity out when you're not. Okay, or when you wouldn't be had you checked back or not made the bet. Okay, so variable bet sizing by position. I take a lot of issue with this. I have for a long time, although I'm kind of coming around to it a little bit, but I'm coming around to it in terms that it is a good exploitative adjustment, and it's a good metagame adjustment to a trend that exists right now. But I don't accept this as an actual fundamentally true thing. I don't think that either of the 2 camps, and a while back there were 2 camps that were kind of in probably not in equal use. When I started playing poker, it was pretty widely accepted that you would open raise 3 or 4 times the big blind, +1 per limper. Then a school of thought emerged that said you should open raise larger from under the gun, smaller from the button, or in between in the middle positions. And then there was a school of thought that I saw come and go that was you should have variable bet sizing in every position. And I saw debates about this. The one that seemed to stick was that we should open raise larger from early position, smaller from late position. But let's look at the arguments that these people use, because it's kind of funny when you think about it. It seems like they're actually using the same types of arguments to argue opposite things. So the player that says we should open raise bigger when we're in early position and smaller from late position, his idea is we're going to have a stronger range when we're in early position, and so we want to get money in the pot and build bigger pots with a stronger range. Then they say we want to give ourselves a better price when we steal. So since we're opening with a lot of hands in late position, we want to use a smaller bet size because we're often going to be stealing. Okay, something intuitively, hopefully, doesn't sound quite right about that, but we'll come back to it. The other argument is we should open raise smaller in early position because we don't have as much incentive to fold our opponents fold them out because we have a stronger range. We don't want to build a bigger pot when we're playing out of position. And when we're in late position, we'd like to build a bigger pot because we have position. And we want to give our opponent in the big blind a bad price to call to increase our fold equity. So both of these arguments are really revolving around this idea that the bigger your bet is, the more fold equity it has, and then this other idea that the stronger your range is, the bigger you would like the pot to be. But both of these schools of thought seem to think somehow they're going to be able to have their cake and eat it too. The reality is, the larger you make your open raise, in theory, and usually in practice, the fewer calls you'll get, and so the less often players will call against you, the more often you'll take the blinds down uncontested, but the bigger the pot will be if you happen to be called. So, this is kind of like paradoxical or circular logic. One guy is saying, well, I want to raise big with my big hands because I want to make big pots. And the other guy is saying, well, I want to raise small when I'm out of position because I don't want to play big pots out of position. But the same guy that's saying, I don't want to play big pots out of position, is saying, I want my opponent to fold when I open from the button. So I don't want to play pots at all when I'm in position. If you take it out, if you kind of take it to its farthest logical conclusion. Now, what's the reality? The reality is these arguments are incredibly redundant. We don't need to make adjustments to our ranges based on position and then go back and tweak our bet sizing. That doesn't make sense. When you adjust your ranges, you're adjusting your ranges based on position, kind of based on the starting premise that we're going to be open raising the same size from each position. That's the kind of the assumption that we start with when we start constructing our ranges. If we're adjusting our ranges and we're opening tighter from early position, wider from later position, we don't then have to go back in and tweak our bet sizing. You don't have to do both. The bet sizing, it's complex, it's complicated, it's tricky, it's an illusion, it's wordplay, it's really, really convoluted. But what it boils down to is there is this give and take scenario. There's this give and take when it comes to sizing your bets. The give and take is the bigger you bet, the less likely you are to be called, but when you are called, you'll have a bigger pot. Now, do you want to make that larger bet size when you have a weaker hand, or do you want to use that larger bet size when you have a stronger hand? And I would say it's got nothing to do with it. It should more have to do with stack sizes, and if you're in a tournament, all kinds of other factors, and even if not, all kinds of other factors. But it doesn't have to do with I should use a bigger bet size with my stronger ranges because what? It doesn't make sense. If you open raise bigger, your opponent will be less likely to call you. If you open raise bigger, your opponent will, when he does call you, have to play a bigger pot with you. Just looking at those two pieces, if we just assume those things are the case, if we assume that the larger we bet, the less often we get called, the bigger the pot is when we do get called, is that an argument for using stronger hands or ranges or weaker hands and ranges? Well, there's pros and cons to both, and I think that fundamentally they are equal and opposite. That exactly the benefits from raising bigger with a stronger range and raising smaller sizing with a weaker, wider range, it's exactly equal and opposite to doing exactly the other thing. Now, sorry, that's really confusing. I hope you're understanding what I'm saying because I'm pretty sure about my intuition on this. But really, it's redundant to take into consideration how bad it is, all the bad things that can happen when you open raise from under the gun. You can end up going 5 ways to the flop when that wasn't your intention. You can see a 3-bet, a 4-bet, and a shove and have to fold almost every hand. There's all kinds of bad things that could happen when you open from under the gun. And the way, or the place we adjust for that, the place we prepare for that, is in our range construction, not in our bet sizing. Okay, so the arguments are redundant. You don't have to adjust the ranges and the bet size. Now, in strictly GTO, if we're talking strictly game theory optimal, I don't think either of those things is I don't think one's better than the other in a strictly game theory optimal sense, but I don't think either of them make sense strictly speaking. However, I do want to add this caveat. I have started to use a smaller open size in late position. I started to do it long ago, and now I'm doing it again. I went a long time raising 3 times the big blind from every position, then went to 4x from under the gun, 3x from middle, and like min raise or min plus raise from late position or button. Then I stopped, and now I'm kind of back to 3 times the big blind from every position, other than cutoff and button. At cutoff, I go 2.5, and from button, I just min raise. But even that's very dependent. And I think what this really is, it's a reaction to the metagame. So, what do I mean by that? Well, the metagame evolves, things change, and they don't necessarily change in a game theory optimal type sense. There's an evolution, and way back when I was playing mostly live underground cash games in Toledo before there was a casino there, I experimented with different bet sizing, and I watched this kind of evolution happen online when I was playing on Party Poker, Pacific Poker, Poker Stars back way before Black Friday. And the evolution was this. People eventually figured out they could literally open raise any 2 cards from the button. They could take their entire range, go 3 times the big blind, and there wasn't a whole lot their opponents could do about it from the blinds. So everyone was stealing from the button. Button steals were absolutely the rule, not the exception. The players in the big blinds, some of them would get stubborn, and they would just start calling, and then they would just check and fold the flop 66% of the time, and kind of wish they'd just fold it. So it was really like you could just open the button for 3 times the big blind and just print money all day. You didn't really care if they called, because most times if they called, they would just check, you would just bet, they would just fold next hand. But then people figured out, well, if these guys are going to be open raising any 2 cards from the button, then I ought to be able to 3-bet light out of the big blind and the small blind and take down a lot of pots, and that's what happened. So once people started making light 3-bets from the blinds, then people had to work on their button game a little bit. What I personally did was tightened my range. I just stopped stealing so light so I would have some hands to fight back with. Probably the best adjustments were to tighten your opening range a little bit. Instead of opening 100%, maybe open 60%, and open a light 4-bet range, and call 3-bets a little bit lighter than you were used to doing. Those were the probably best adjustments while we were still stuck in this 3 times the big blind paradigm. But the problem here is, if you're using 3 times the big blind when your opponents are almost never calling, and it did get to the point where the big blind and the small blind almost never flat called versus a button steal, well, even any attempt to steal. Once we got to that level where our opponents in the blinds were playing a very 3-bet or fold game, it no longer makes sense to 3x the button. And it's not got anything to do with what's right or wrong in a game theory sense or what's fundamentally correct. It's just got to do with the fact that your opponent is imbalanced. He's not flatting. He's 3-betting too much. His 3-bet range is too wide. And the way to exploit a player who's never going to call is going to be to open raise with a min raise. If he's never going to call, then your min raise accomplishes exactly the same thing in terms of stealing the pot as your 3 times the big blind raise does. But it also has some advantages that 3 times the big blind raises do not have. And again, this is just a metagame thing. Only when your opponents are re-stealing a lot, it makes sense to use a smaller open raising size from the button as an exploitative adjustment because, number one, you don't lose as much money when you have to fold. So when you're at the very bottom of your range and you open and they 3-bet and you fold, your steal attempt that failed did not lose as much money as a larger steal attempt would have, obviously. Another advantage is, because we do want to be taking more flops in position when we know that our opponents are 3-betting light out of the big blind and the small blind, using a smaller bet sizing is going to allow you to flat call more often against your opponent's re-steals and take a flop in position with a good, healthy stack-to-pot ratio and plenty of implied odds. If you open for 3 times the big blind with a hand like Jack-6 suited, and your opponent makes it 10 times the big blind, 11 times the big blind, it's going to be probably a losing proposition to call if you started with 100 big blinds. But if you're starting with 100 big blinds and you min-raise Jack-6 suited, and your opponent makes it like 6 or 7 times the big blind as a 3-bet, now you can flat call, take a flop in position with a speculative hand, and against a weak range. And as long as you have playing skill advantage, you've got position, you should be able to make money there. And certainly with hands like Jack-10, Jack-8 suited, Jack-9 offsuit, certainly those types, saying pocket 2s, Ace-5 suited type stuff. So, by using a smaller bet size, specifically against players that are playing 3-bet or fold, your steals accomplish exactly what they would have accomplished. They either take the blinds or they don't. Your speculative hands are allowed to see the flop without relinquishing their equity share, which is obviously an advantage. And also it allows you to open a light 4-bet range and not be anything like pot committed or stuck to calling. So you can, let's say you make it 3 times the big blind from the button, and the big blind goes 10 times the big blind, then maybe you decide to make it 30 times the big blind, and they ship it in your face. It's going to be pretty hard to fold. I mean, you're getting just a really good price, and you're in kind of a sick situation, and it's going to be unpleasant when they catch you at the bottom of your range there. Now, if you use a min-raise, and your opponent makes it even 7 times the big blind, and you go to 20 or 21 times the big blind as a 4-bet, you can easily fold. Not a problem at all. So that it gives you this extra ability to make a non-committing 4-bet, so that you can make light 4-bets and fold to raises. So what I'm saying here is, don't believe that it is strictly true that you ought to use this type of strategy, but understand that at least right now, and at least in my opinion, it does make sense to do purely for metagame reasons. Okay, open tighter ranges versus smaller reshove stacks. Tournament players have been saying this a long time, and most of the really good tournament players that I've talked to, whether it be players that I've coached, players that have coached me, or players that I talked to on the phone or on the forums, or Skype, I guess, they'll almost universally they will tell you that if you're in a situation in a tournament where you've got like an average stack and you're in late position, say you're cut off, and the button only has 10 big blinds, the small blind has 12, and the big blind has like 18, that you should tighten up your opening range, because you don't want to have to call when one of these players with a good reshove stack or just a short stack moves all in against you. So since you're not going to be able to fold, you need to open a tighter range. And I think this is just ludicrous. It's nonsense. It really is nonsense. Because this is not a wordplay I'm about to use here. They say you have to call. You don't want to open too many hands because when your opponent shoves, you have to call. But you don't have to call. What they really mean is that it is profitable for you to call. So I would like you to think about this, and then in the comments explain to me how it could be that the existence of players behind you who have the inability to put you in a spot where you either have to relinquish your equity after opening or make a fold when players do not have enough money in their stack to put you in a negative EV spot by shoving on you. how could it be that that would give you incentive to open a tighter range? How could it possibly disincentivize you from opening? You know, this idea that your opponents can shove on you and you'll have to call, therefore you shouldn't open as wide, is ridiculous, because it stems from this, I think it stems from an emotion. The emotion is, I opened, my opponent had a short stack and he shoved, which I'm not too surprised about. He's all in, and now I have to call, and I wish I hadn't opened. Okay, well, that's emotional. You wish you hadn't opened, but you know that you do have to call if you want to make the right decision. So having to call on grounds that it's the right decision is the exact same thing as saying you have a profitable call. So, if the open raise itself was profitable, and now calling will be profitable, even though open raising might have been better had your opponents just folded, and even though you'd certainly rather have a stronger hand, it cannot be the case that you would literally prefer that the opponents behind you have enough money to cause you to fold your equity and make folding preferable to calling than the opposite situation where the opponents behind you can't possibly make you cause you to make a negative EV decision. And maybe I'm making this more complicated than it has to be, but what I'm saying is, if you've got two choices, one of them is you open raise to 2.5 times the big blind, and a player moves all in with 11 big blinds, and you've got something like 8-7 suited, and you've got a profitable call. So if you have these decisions, if you have to decide between opening for 2.5 times the big blind with 8-7 suited and having a 10 big blind stack move all in on you, or having 8-7 suited from same position, opening, and having one of these players that has 100 big blinds make it, I don't know, like 6, 7, 8, 9 times the big blind, it 3-bet you, which is going to force you to fold. Would you prefer, or even if somebody has like a 30 big blind stack and then shoves, how could you possibly prefer that the opponent that you're facing has more chips and more options than he has less chips, less options? How could you possibly prefer that your only decision when 3-bet is to fold compared to having a profitable call? I mean, you still have the option to fold if you really want to. So you're not saying you have to call, you're saying you have a profitable call. Your opponent's inability to put you in a non-profitable situation by shoving cannot be used as a deterrent for your opening range. Never show your hand. Okay, so it's probably not bad advice, just kind of as a blanket statement, but there really are times when it's good to show your hand. I'm going to just talk about 2 examples. I was in a live 2-5 game at the Toledo, the Hollywood Casino in Toledo. This is going back about 7, 8 months probably, and I had ace-king suited, bet flop against kind of a calling station, but it was a discombobulated flop. I had a nut flush draw. No, I didn't either. Okay, I'm telling you wrong. It was a queen of. All right. In any case, a few months back, 8 months ago, I'm playing in a 2-5 game against a guy who probably calls too often. He's a calling station, but he does play fit or fold on the flop mostly. I had some kind of backdoor draws, a combination of backdoor draws. I think it was ace-king suited with the queen of my suit. In any case, I bet, and he called. But he looked like he was reluctant to call. The turn came, and it gave me a straight flush draw. So I bombed the turn, even though I very rarely do this against calling stations or bad players. It just seemed like the most pristine bluff situation ever, with a big draw against a player who seemed reluctant to call in the first place. The river card comes off, it's a brick, I missed everything, and I bet pretty big. He tanked forever, and he eventually folded. He had one pair, and he gave it up. He flashes it face up, and I returned the favor and showed my hand face up. Now, some of you might grimace or wince in pain and disgust and say, that's terrible, you should never do that. But why did I do that? Well, for one thing, I want him to show me his hands in the future. So one reason you might show an opponent a hand is if you think he will return the favor, or if he already showed you his hand, by you showing him your hand, you might get him to show you more hands in the future. Since you are probably going to be able to utilize that information and process it more effectively than your opponent can, that can be a net gain, so long as there aren't a table full of people that are able to assimilate that information, assuming you're not able to play the metagame and level correctly. So that can be one reason. It can be just polite. It can encourage your opponents to do it, which is going to probably work to your advantage. But in that particular instance, that's not the only reason I showed my hand. I showed my hand because in the 6-7 months that I'd been playing poker at that place, I had never ran a bluff like that before, and I had no intention of doing it anytime in the near future. By showing these guys that I'm capable of bluffing, these are people whose main mistake propensity is that they call too much. They go too far with hands. What I'm doing most of the time is I'm value owning them. I'm very rarely bluffing. So if I can take this guy who already really wants to call me, and I can sow a seed of doubt into his head, I can show him that I am capable of betting flop, turn, and making a big bet on the river with nothing, then I can encourage him to make more calling mistakes in the future, which is fantastic as long as I also have the wisdom then to back off and not run those bluffs anymore. If you show somebody, people remember what they see. Show them one time and see how long it stays in their mind. The other time that I can remember in fairly recent history showing a hand and feeling like it was the right thing to do, I was in a spot where I had a very loose, aggressive, but pretty poor post-flop player sitting to my immediate right, opening a ton of hands, and I was making a lot of money by flat calling him and outplaying him post-flop. So I was taking hands like King, Queen, Pocket Nines, Ace Jack, Ace 10 suited, and just flatting them, even though I know he's opening really wide, and going to the flop in position with card edge and a skill advantage. Then a guy sits down and starts spoiling there's a little fly that comes into my ointment. A guy pulls up a chair. He was a younger guy. I don't remember if he was literally wearing headphones, but he was the type, like the backpack headphone type. Aspiring pro, I guess, I don't know. And he was squeezing to no end. It seemed like every time the guy, this loose aggressive opener to my right, was ISO raising or open raising, and I was flat calling his raise just every time this kid was squeezing. It was really annoying, and the first thing I thought was, well, great, now I have just got to start playing 3-bet or fold, and I don't want to take King, Queen, and 3-bet it against a guy who's opening wide, but probably not calling 3-bets wide. It might well be aggressive enough to 4-bet as a bluff or quote for information or whatever. I just want to flat call in position and take flops against the guy, and this kid to my immediate, 2 seats to my left, is making it very difficult for me to do that. And so I'm thinking, well, I guess I'm going to have to just play raise or fold, 3-bet or fold against this guy, because I don't want to be squeezed. And then I pick up pocket queens, and the guy to my right, the loose aggressive player, open raised, and I just flatted with the queens, and the squeeze-happy kid behind me did his thing. He squeezed. He made a very big squeeze. Action comes back to the guy to my right who folds. Action is on me, and I just rip it in his face. I just shoved my stack into this kid's face, and he tanked. He deliberated. He felt like something was amiss. He thought I might be bluffing, but it seemed that way. But apparently did not have a big enough hand to call with, and he folded it. And I showed him the queens, making the statement. Every time I flat call, I don't have a weak hand. I am capable of flatting you with aces, kings, queens, ace, king, and back raising. Showing him that hand that one time caused him to literally never squeeze me for the entire, 3-4 hours I was there playing with him after that. I mean, it got the message across well enough that either he was worried if he started squeezing I would start doing that stuff again, or he just realized that, hey, sometimes this isn't going to work. Maybe I should calm down. Maybe I should pick my spots better. Whatever the reason was, by virtue of me making the play and then showing him the big hand, I stopped him from doing that, which allowed me to play the game I wanted to play with the guy to my immediate right. Opening tighter range versus smaller reshove stack. I think we already did that. Never show your hand. Okay, overbetting is rarely correct, and you should be using a more standard bet size. Okay, so first of all, I want to say standard bet sizing is mostly a construct of human brains and it doesn't have much to do with the underlying mathematics of poker. Now, there are some bet sizes that seem to work better than others, but there's nothing saying that you should not ever overbet. In fact, 2 points I want to make here and be absolutely clear about. Point number one, overbetting is absolutely part of a game theory optimal strategy. It most commonly comes up if you're overbetting. The most common situation where it comes up is when you have a polarized range and your opponent's range is almost entirely or entirely made of bluff catchers and showdown value. In practice, in game, the way this comes up often is when an opponent makes a non-procedural check back. An opponent gives up the lead at some point in the hand. So maybe he was pre-flop razor and he checks the flop back. Most of the time when a player checks a street, they're capping their range. Once your opponent caps his range, he doesn't have a huge hand. This comes up a lot with pretty good players. Well, I'll do this. If I have pocket kings and I 3-bet pre-flop, get called, I'm in position, and the flop comes out ace XX, very often it's going to go check here. My opponent checks, I check back, and that way I can either induce a bluff and call it on the turn, or I can induce lighter call downs when he checks the turn. I can start value betting against his jacks or queens or whatever he happens to have. But if you see an opponent doing this, then you can really put him in a big bind by overbetting the turn and jamming the river. So overbets are absolutely part of a good strategy. They're part of a game theory strategy, and they're a good method for exploiting certain players in certain situations. Usually, the times you're going to want to overbet are going to be times when you have a polarized range and your opponent has bluff catchers. But really, you can dip into the your bag of tricks and pull the overbet out anytime your opponent caps his range. When you still have an uncapped range and your opponent caps their range, you can overbet a lot of value hands and a significant number of bluffs for balance. And something that's interesting that a lot of people don't seem to understand is the bigger your bet sizing, the more bluffs you can pull into your range and still be balanced. I'm not sure what the confusion is there, but probably not something we're going to have time to talk about now. There's other bet sizes that you don't just have to use half pot bets and 3/4 size pot bets. When we bring up things like value targeting, bluff targeting, if you can shave a little bit off of your bets in order to get just as many folds or almost as many folds and find kind of that sweet spot, you can use non-standard bet sizing exploitatively. And there's nothing about game theory optimal strategy that creates half pot, 2/3 pot, and full pot bet sizings. That's a construct of poker players, not game theory. The idea of fighting fire with fire is ridiculous. Every great once in a while a situation arises in the real world where you want to meet force with force or what have you, but it is far more likely in reality outside of the poker room or away from the felt, and it's also far and away more likely to be the correct thing at the poker table that you would fight fire with water, not fight fire with fire. An example of this is a lot of times when players are super aggressive, they get a lot of pushback. I've noticed it myself when I'm running good and I'm making a lot of 3 bets and I'm making a lot of 2 bets, opening a lot of pots. People start 3 betting me. People start 4 betting me. This does happen. But understand this. If your opponent is overly aggressive, the exploitative adjustment that you should be making is to simply call him more often and raise him less often. You don't fight fire with fire, you fight fire with water. If your opponent's a calling station, you don't station it up with him. You value bet the hell out of him and you cut off your the bluff part of your range. You take a lot more thin value bets and a lot more bet fold blinds, right? You don't play like your opponents to beat them, and that's true whether they're overly aggressive, overly tight, overly anything. Slow playing does make sense. I know there's a lot of people that say that you should never slow play because you should balance towards aggression, and if you're playing aggressively enough, you shouldn't have a need to slow play. But that's a slightly naive version of the truth. And the other thing that people, used to say, and some people still have this misconception, that poker is just strictly a game of spreading misinformation, and slow playing is the second coolest, second best, most important part of poker. That the most important thing is bluffing, and the second most important thing is slow playing, and of course neither of those things are true. The actual reasons that you would want to slow play a big hand, according to game theory, is almost always going to be to protect the ranges that the other ranges that you play this way. In other words, you're just talking about a situation where you have pocket kings and 3-bet, and you go to the flop and it's an ace XX flop. Checking that flop back can make a lot of sense. But if your opponent knows you're always checking back showdown value, second pair, things like that, then he can overbet turns, overbet jam rivers, and there's nothing you can really do about it. Or is there? Well, there is. You can start checking back your sets. It doesn't take that many times for you to check back top 2 pair and make up for all the pots your opponent stole off of you when you check back showdown value if he's making really big overbets. And the bigger his overbets are, the less often he's got to run into it, run into one of your slow-played monsters for you to recoup all of your money. Especially if you call and he goes for it again, or whatever. So, slow playing is a part of game theory optimal strategy. And it can be very useful in other ways, like when you've got small stacks, a very small stack to pot ratio. Sometimes you can flop a set, and it makes more sense to check back on the flop than it does to bet the flop, because not only are you going to get stacks in against the value parts of your opponent's range, the same as you would have had you just bet flop and shove turn, but now you also give your opponent the option to bluff the turn and maybe bluff the river. So there are reasons to slow play, but the reasons are not because it's cool or because it's fun or because poker's about tricking your opponent somehow. They are for balance. They're for giving your opponent a chance to kind of catch up. If you've got the deck on complete lockdown, you've got pocket aces and the flop comes ace-ace-2, well, that might be a spot where you can slow play because you need your opponent to have some chance of having a hand that can pay you, and you give them a chance to bluff. So there are reasons for slow playing, but slow playing should be the exception, not the rule. And a little bit of it goes a long way. And remember, when you check back a set on the flop as pre-flop raiser, that is really something you're doing, or ought to be doing, to protect the times you're checking back second pair. You're balancing against those. So as long as you understand the rationale and the reasons, then it does make a lot of sense, or it can make a lot of sense to at least occasionally add slow plays to your ranges. Tight, aggressive, razor fold poker is the only way to win is, of course, not the case. Now, this is something I think is kind of funny. It used to be, I listened to all this crap when I was coming up playing, just learning to play the game and getting serious about it. When you raise, 3 things can happen. 2 of them are good. They can either fold the best hand, they can fold the worst hand, or they can call. No, the way they said is they can call with the best hand, they can call with the worst hand, or they can fold. Those were the only 3 things that could happen. 2 of those things are good, and the other one's not that bad. Okay, sure. And if you have a decision between raising, folding, or calling, don't compromise. Calling is a compromise, and compromising is exactly what you don't want to do. And there could be some iotas of truth around and about these concepts somewhere, but they're definitely oversimplifications at best. In reality, it turns out there are very good reasons to flat call. The biggest one is sometimes you have a hand that is not strong enough to raise for value, but it is too strong to fold. In these cases, the best answer is very often to check and then to call. I mean, it sounds simple, right? Well, that's because it is simple. Another time that comes up that it makes sense to call is pre-flop, when you have a hand that is probably ahead of your opponent's opening range, but it won't be ahead of their calling range should you decide to 3-bet. In those cases, it can make a lot of sense to call, or it can make a lot of sense to call with speculative hands that have a lot of implied value, but that don't have the capacity for flopping frequent strength or dominating hands that would call your raises. So there are definitely reasons to flat call in poker. Don't be fooled. There's a lot of good players that are even open limping again. Like, that's starting to come back into fashion. I'm not quite sold on it yet, but I'm open to it. So in conclusion, and that's a perfect segue. This idea that limping is coming back into favor. You should always think about the implications of whatever piece of advice you get, and you should analyze it. You should see, what does it mean? What does this mean if I take it to its furthest extreme? And what does it mean in general? What does it mean when I apply it in this situation? Does it hold all the time, or does it only sometimes hold? Is this a rule of thumb, or is this truly a fundamental truth about poker? And you should be very slow to change your mind about things when you don't understand the ins and outs of it. Don't just take somebody's word for it, even if they're much better than you. Of course, granted, if there's a consensus among good players, it's most often going to be the case that it's the truth. But it's not always going to be the truth. And just because one player, one person who's a game you respect, just because they say something, that doesn't mean it's true. It's possible to be much better than somebody else at poker, but on one specific item, even an item of potentially big consequence, to be completely off on it. And if we know anything about poker and poker strategy and the metagame, is what is commonly accepted among the best players in the world is constantly evolving and changing. What is standard today will almost certainly not be standard in 2 months. Just like open limping used to be done all the time, then people stopped limping entirely, and then they started just over limping some, and now good players are back to open limping some. I'm not there yet, but I would not doubt one bit that I am there eventually. So if we know anything about poker strategy, it's that standard continually changes. I guess that's going to wrap it up. Hopefully I managed to come in a little bit later than an hour and 10 minutes this time. I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave any comments. If you have coaching requests, I have nobody that I'm coaching right now. I'm totally open. I've got at least 2 days a week open where I can do that, or I should say at least 1 day a week, maybe 2 days a week. Get a hold of me. Hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, good luck. That's quote. Jeez, oh Pete. That is quotation mark, LUCK, end quote, exclamation point, luck, like air quote, luck. Yeah, until next time, guys. Over and out. Navonod, laters.